Greetings. Greetings, good people. I'm here, Ian McKenzie, co-host of this series, The Pandemic is a Prism, and I'm joined by...
Hi, everyone. It's Zamir. Happy to be with you today. And we just want to give you a little recap on our amazing conversation that we had last week with Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris.
Yeah, and to maybe give a little bit of what the intention is of these recaps, as they're called, is we discovered pretty quickly, I mean, we've only had 2 conversations so far in the series, the first with Charles Eisenstein and now Elisabet, that there was so much that was stirred within the conversation itself that we felt, you know what, maybe it was appropriate to create the space where we could reflect on, you know, what stood with us or what stirred us after the fact, and then share it live like as we're doing now in this conversation, and then that could live on as a companion to the episodes that we're doing. So that's a little bit of the intention around why we're doing these recaps. They're meant to be short, lean, 30 minutes tops. But just to give you a little bit of what was talked about, how it stirred us, and here we are.
Yeah. So do you want to play that little clip? They can get a sense of Elisabet, and give us a starting point to launch off a bit to what
Absolutely.
we did. Yeah.
Sure. Here's a brief little clip from that interview with Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris.
Yeah. What would be the response from a mature species to the incoming or visitation of a virus that affects the whole world, that is scientifically sound and leads us in that direction of sustainability and inclusivity? Like, how do we mature in our response to this?
Well, the mature response would have been to do both cures and start developing a vaccine. If you didn't know, exactly what this disease was, yes, you would probably start working on a vaccine, although I'm not sure that they work on physiological levels, but even the ones in the past, there are some odd issues about them. But let's say for all intents and purposes that up to now vaccines have done good, and that you would work on cures and vaccines. But for some reason, the government couldn't get the emergency use of vaccines out there if there had been any cures. Now, we know that the cures work. We know so many places in the world, and occasionally somebody says something about it. Even Biden's chief COVID officer was on mainstream news one night saying he had just learned about cures from Mexico, and was that canned quickly. He wasn't allowed to say that again. And many journalists have come out and said, we're not allowed to talk about cures. And so this clampdown on cures is the strangest thing from any rational perspective. And it's the thing that I want to focus on most is, look, people, if so many people out there in the world are healing this disease with medications that are cheap and supplements that are inexpensive as well, let's focus on what we need to build our immune systems. We have to keep on fighting against the toxification of our food supply. We must do that, or we're going to kill ourselves off. We've already destroyed fertility and all kinds of things, this way. So can we focus on the positive things that we should be pushing?
And so that was just a bite size, I think, of the whole conversation, which, again, I found surprising from a lot of perspectives or a lot of angles. I mean, speaking with an evolutionary biologist who also had done many impressive things in her vast career, speaking with such sort of clarity around certain things that are highly contentious. And so anyway, I'm curious, Samir, that particular clip stood out for you as well. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, I think one thing that she presented, because you got to think about the viewpoint that she's coming from. And part of what we want to do with this series, Pandemic is a Prism, is like look through the prism to see a different view, right? And so hers is as an evolutionary biologist, right? An understanding of how we have evolved in as a total conglomeration of the planet, right? And species maturation is something that she's very, very has a lot of insight in. So what she was talking about at some point was that, all species come to this fork, and the fork is, do they going to continue with the empire-based path of development, which is usually based on competition, on extraction of resources, and it helps it to grow and build very fast, but that at some point it becomes inefficient, even resource inefficient, and then it has to kind of collapse in on itself. Whereas if the species chooses the fork of maturation, it's going to lead towards a more inclusive, a more sustainable, a more diverse culture. And that's going to allow it to thrive in coexistence, right? And so she kind of has this larger overview, and you can see that even just from her perspective here, saying, well, the mature response would be to work on both. That, we would work on cures as well as work on and develop vaccines, but really encourage and look at what are some of the underlying systemic issues that make us very vulnerable. And also, let's get curious as to why we are taking an empire dominating approach to only have one mono solution that is pushed, rather than the diversity of responses that's available and not allowing for that. She's saying that kind of response is an empire-based response.
Mm. It harkens back a little bit to what Charles talked about, actually, this being able to understand again, I don't know what to call it, like the scientific response, because I mean, all sides have different ways of using science, but the sense of it being a religion, right? Like that to me struck home, and it still continues to reverberate for me, that it's almost like being able to interact with the dominant approach as a kind of religion. Not saying it's devoid of other consensus-based science, for example, but that to me has more of a rings true, because then I also think of monotheistic religions, right? And how if one is able to see a kind of intolerance that comes born from this belief in the one true way, right? Then we start to see like, okay, that's why a diversity of possibilities actually not, quote, accepted or allowed, because there's an undercurrent running of a kind of monotheistic necessity. But in this case, the backing of it is not because of belief in, some otherworldly God, for example, but in science itself as a God, or at least that understanding of science. And it's, again, I'm not trying to demonize the sides, but to me, that starts to illuminate, okay, and why is it that empire sees something, as a virus, identifies it as a threat, because it causes harm to humans, and therefore it needs to be eradicated. I mean, that is the language of war that's been used over and over and over again in the mainstream establishment, as well as this idea of we need to win, right? We need to beat this thing, which is, from an evolutionary biologist perspective, which I think Elisabet was speaking to, and seeing all of life as an interdependent macro organism, right? Now it's like, it's bizarre to think that would be the approach to life, another kind of life. Right. But it's maybe similar in the way that she talked about the narrow view of evolution is based on a Darwinian understanding, right? Competition, survival of the fittest. But if you expand the view to include, okay, all of the interrelationships of life, you realize, oh, the Darwinian bit is only just a little part of the much grander symphony. And so in the same way, yeah, I see that as kind of what she's speaking to is, well, wait a second, there's actually a bigger story happening here. And we miss it if we're focused on this narrow part, like this is a war, we need to win.
Yeah, I think you're a couple of things I want to respond to. One, first, in that Darwinian view, there's something called social Darwinism that really began out of the late 18th, early coming into the 19th century. And essentially what they were looking for, especially the sort of like the industrialists of society, were looking at a biological justification for sort of unbridled competition and the growth of industrial capitalism. And so, survival of the fittest, maxims like this are great for being able to justify why we should be able to have a system that is filled with inequalities and I would say rewards those that are in the pursuit of competition and exploitation, right? And that the people who are the ones that kind of survive in that system, they're the ones that are continued, genetically, and that will ensure our survival and success as a species. And, at that time, you see how those social Darwinist policies have caused and wreak havoc around the world. And we continue to see it today with this massive growth of wealth, with numbers of billionaires, that is rewarding with this sort of survival of the fittest mentality, why there's so many people who are struggling. I just saw an article today that these Pandora papers leaked, and over $600 million per year is lost in tax havens, right? And, we just encourage this, as a culture, we allow it, right? And so looking at this, if we see even the consequences of the response to COVID, really it's the people largely in urban centers who are more of higher financial means are the ones that are the most affected, and they're pursuing policies that have the biggest economic impact on people who are in lower income classes. Right. Then the numbers of starvation that have gone up are immense. The loss of tourism and jobs in people who have in a lower economic sector are manifold greater than those who are living in urban centers, right, and who are more privileged. So we can see that we're even sort of taking a Darwinian response to who really gets to kind of survive from this.
Interesting. I mean, there's a few threads in there for sure, but I suppose for me that the piece that I found interesting was I think the recognition that what is the end story here that's being also spoken to? Like, what is I guess in some ways, how does the vaccine, for example, create a sense of assuaging the undercurrent of anxiety around all these other bigger forces that are also at play in cascading crises, and how the cognitive dissonance that arises, in some ways, no matter on what side you're in or on, that it's too difficult actually to hold the cognitive dissonance. So it's almost by necessity to collapse it into a particular decision. And, she spoke even to her own experiences with her friends. This is Elisabet's network. And she outed herself, in terms of her own vaccine status, which again was surprising to me, and also spoke to, she spoke about how challenging it was for her friends to just be in the kind of the ambivalence of it, and not to say ambivalence as a sort of passive thing, but just to navigate different realities of the situation, right? And how that is actually it's burdensome in some ways. So it's easier in a way to decide. But then once you decide, is that you suddenly tend to draw a line and say, okay, now I'm on this side. That means I have to believe all these other things, or I have to approach the other side in this way. When, again, before that line was drawn, there was actually a multiplicity of possibilities still available.
Totally. And that takes us right back to your comment around religion, right? I mean, there's the deeper spiritual esoteric understanding of religion comes from Latin re ligare, which means to rebond or reconnect, right? The root of the word ligament. And what is the ligament doing? It's providing that function in the body for things to connect and be yoked and work together. But the conventional meaning of religion, and the one that I think many of us have developed an allergic reaction to after what we've seen the atrocities of religion, is this sort of dogmatic authoritarian view. And what religions provide in sort of the conventional sense of the masses is it provides a sense of authority, right? And this authority is needed. We need to know someone that we can say, okay, we trust in this authority because it's speaking about something that affects our lives, but we don't really know or understand, or we can't see. Right. And of course, science is going to provide a very helpful role in that, because science is an authority on many truths about life, of most events that we can't observe or see as, common citizens, except by, the clergy of the science who can do that. Now, there's immense benefits that have come from science and from trusting the authority of science. But just because benefits have come doesn't mean that there are not many ways in which we can be led astray. Right. And we when we trust blindly in that, authority, especially if it has a sort of an agenda or sort of a paradigm. And I think that Elisabet and Charles spoke to this, that science is not without its own blinders, without its own rigid viewpoints and things that it allows in and doesn't. That's limited by the paradigm of what is reality that it is adhered to in the status quo. And that becomes dangerous, right? Because there's other things that other people can see and perceive that might not be accepted by the authorities of science, but that doesn't mean that it's not true.
Well, thanks for that. And this, I think, also is helpful to differentiate between, again, I think it's a fallacy to say that the sides, in this case, pro and anti-vax, one side has science on their side and the other has science. The way I've heard it spoken, let's say by, quote, anti-vaxxers, is that they're all about science, just not industry distorted science, for example, which to me is helpful, because I think it can be too simplistic to create that as an opposition. Now, the other thing, though, is I think I liked what Elisabet presented with this model she gave of almost like, well, it was a keyboard, right? Of I don't know, the spectrum of maybe consciousness or perceptions of reality. And she showed how, yeah, like a lower octaves, let's say, or lower keys on the keyboard, certain ways of perceiving were part of that spectrum. But then you go up the spectrum, then there's other certain ways of perceiving, and then you go even more, and then you have things that are more esoteric or esoteric to the dominant culture, which is sort of fit in the middle of a sort of rational materialistic paradigm, where you have to, only thing that's real is that which can be measured, right? Is how she phrased it. And yet, of course, I mean, spiritual traditions and meditation and so many other realms seem available, but they're invisible to a methodology that will only allow what's true, again, which can be measured, it can be seen by its own way of approaching. And so that I thought was actually kind of helpful, because in some ways that also explains the inherent blind spots of wherever one is on the positionality, like of the spectrum. Because if you literally, I mean, another way to say it maybe is that, and this actually taps in a little bit to our next speaker, Stephen Jenkinson, but he said about other things in particular, but this idea, when you seek something, you find yourself, right? But what he means is you find your way of looking at the thing, right? And then, but if you're not aware of how you're looking or how you're approaching, you're just going to see the thing and say, oh, that's what it is, right? But actually what's going on is you're seeing your way of seeing unawares.
Absolutely. Yeah. Seeing your way of seeing is what you're seeing. Nice little tongue twister, but that is kind of what we're talking about, right? About looking through the prism. And,
you did have a beautiful thing though, by the way. This might be a good time just to mention the Rumi poem that you offered recently. We sent it out as a newsletter, but perhaps it could be apropos to share that story actually in the context of that idea of how do we perceive what we see, or how do we perceive only parts of what we see?
Yeah, well, the story goes, it's a well-known Vedic story about how there's an elephant in a dark room, and each person goes and enters, and each of them touches the elephant at a different place and describes what they believe this object to be. So someone touches the ear and says, oh, it's a big fan. And someone touches the leg and says, oh, this is a large pillar of a building. And someone touches the trunk and says, oh, this is like a large water pipe. And someone touches the tusk and says, ah, this is a sharp porcelain sword. And each of them, believes that what they touched is the truth, but really they were only able to describe the area in which they could sense or have contact with, until a child walked into the room and illuminated the elephant in its true form. And Rumi said, well, perhaps if we each walk in with a candle, we'll be able to see the whole picture, right? But that candle is a metaphor for the inner light, as you said, the ability to be able to see our own viewpoint in operation, to see the constructs that we carry within us that cause us to see something a certain way. And when we can see how we see, when we can understand the nature of our own viewpoints, then we can truly enter into kind of a holistic dialogue and say, oh, I see this as it is. And I also see why and how I'm seeing it this way. And when different people can do that, all of a sudden you really get to see a larger picture, right? Which is what we're trying to do with the series. And, hopefully we'll be able to do that. I did want to touch on one other thing, which is that on that note of Darwinism, there was another theorist in Russia. His name was Peter Kropotkin, and he wrote a book called Mutual Aid. Okay, now mutual aid was it came out of the study of cooperative or colony species, whereas Darwin studying Galapagos Island, and it's quite a harsh environment. Everything does have to compete to survive. Whereas when you study colony species like ants or bees, you see a tremendous amount of cooperation, of balance of roles, of a way in which it's not rooted in sort of fighting against each other, right? And he said that this is actually the evolutionary vision that we have to follow according to nature, which is mutual aid, right? In mutuality. And I think that aligns with what Elisabet was saying, which is we have to look at mutuality. and diversity of viewpoints and perspectives and approaches towards challenges, right? That's what a mature species does. So going back to that original, argument that if we recognize that many people are sincerely trying to address the issues that this pandemic is bringing about at a root level, some people are developing vaccinations out of that, which is going to help a lot of people. According to others, it'll harm a lot of people. And their research in that area will help to illuminate how the vaccines could actually provide harm to people. And that could assist in the people who are developing the vaccines to alleviate those, right? Because they're focusing in that area. Other people are focusing on building natural immunity, right? And they're finding new substances and new ways to increase our immune system to either increase our recovery time or prevent the illness from setting in altogether. Amazing, something for us to learn from that, right? But if we don't, and we go this empire model, which she touched upon, saying, she gave an example of the merger between Bayer and Monsanto, right? Which is saying the same people that are poisoning our food through chemicals are the ones that are creating the medicines to help cure us of it. And she said, that's when you get into dangerous territory, right? There's a rap group I like, and they had this song, and they say, we call them the lemon heads of life. That's when we lick off all the yellow and we sell the white. Right. And that's what's happening. Right. And people are like, whoa, wait a minute. You licking off all the yellow and selling the white? That doesn't feel good to me. Right. And that's what empire tries to do. We got to be mindful of that.
I mean, yeah, thanks for that. This is really interesting. It stirred in me too. I mean, just something that I've been just really reflecting on around what often seems to perpetuate or to coalesce among the quote unquote anti-vax side, which is a strong distrust of authority and institutions. And then on the pro side, often there's this like, well, yeah, but this is the best bet we have to proceed with, this scientifically sound approach to these things and da-da-da. But for me, I'm really with this question too of like, how does Western society or maybe Western industrial society, just to give that example on this side of the planet, how does it have any moral authority at all to claim any sort of leadership at all in terms of its buckling of the biosphere, the decimation of species, the colonial empire organization of society? Like, as in, if you really were able to take a step back and say, wait a second, these are the people that are leading, towards what kind of future, which already seems present. Like, as in, you can see where it's going, which I think was, again, touching back to what Charles was saying. So in that sense, it's no wonder then the people that are less willing to just sort of go along with the program are saying like, hey, wait a second, people, how is it that we're taking or remaining to look to leadership in people that have so bankrupted themselves based on the actual evidence of what's going on right now, particularly, again, species extinction and climate change and all the rest. So for me, it's like, if you're able to approach it that way, it's like this, no wonder. And for me, the learning of the pandemic is the question for me, is like, what is there to learn, right? Because if it's simply, let's fix this or let's win as soon as possible so we can just get back to it, triumphant human striving, or maybe triumphant industrial civilization striving, then we've learned nothing, right? Then it's just simply headed towards the same cliff we were headed towards already. Whereas there's perhaps a different invitation, which is actually saying, like you said, if everyone could sit down and say, well, what piece do you have about what's going on right now? And how does this truly inform how we might reorganize our societies, our way we are with each other, our way we are with life, right? Like, that to me is the real question in the center. And I don't see that really meaningfully centered, even in many ways, even on both, right? Because one is in a way so reactive to the dominant narrative that even that gets missed. It's a bit more, it's still a human-centric narrative often, which is also why, for example, we have other guests coming on in the future that are going to invite, I would say, decentered human narratives on this conversation as well.
Yeah. Well, we have Stephen Jenkinson tomorrow. Indeed. And he's, I think he's going to do a brilliant job in illuminating some of these perspectives for us. And I think that's, what time is that tomorrow?
That is 11:45 p.m. on Wednesday, October 6th. You can check it out. Go to gatheringofstories.com/pandemic to purchase access to that direct talk or to the whole series, where you can, again, get access to the ones we've already done and the ones to come. That's the best way to support these threads and to be informed.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Ian, and everybody out there listening. And I guess we look forward to seeing you tomorrow if you're there, or just join the Gathering of Stories group on Facebook. We'll post more outtakes and other content, because we got to carry the candle into the room together and see what's there, right?
Beautiful. Okay, brother, to be continued.
Okay, bye.